On PrimeTime Politics tonight, Canada's vaccine experts provide new guidance on the one-dose Johnson & Johnson vaccine, saying it might be better to wait for a different vaccine if you can. As Alberta gains the dubious distinction as one of North America's COVID hotspots, we'll speak with an expert on how Alberta got so bad and what should be done to regain control of the wave. And the Conservatives call for the firing of the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff as opposition parties ramp up pressure on the government over its handling of the allegations of sexual misconduct against the former Chief of the Defence Staff. And our Monday panel of parliamentary journalists weigh in on the top stories of the day. But we'll begin tonight with the latest on vaccines in Canada. The National Advisory Committee on Immunization today recommended the one-dose Johnson & Johnson vaccine only be administered to people 30 years of age and older. And those people, NACI says, may prefer to wait for either the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines. That advice contradicts the authorization from Health Canada that recommended use of the J&J vaccine for anyone over the age of 18. NACI also suggested the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines are preferable for pregnant women. The committee cited recent concerns about blood clots for their reasoning. Johnson & Johnson has agreed to supply Canada with 38 million doses, but Health Canada is holding back the first 300,000 doses Canada has received over quality control concerns at a U.S. manufacturing plant.
They need to make an informed choice as to whether they would prefer to get vaccinated sooner with a Janssen or AstraZeneca vaccine, or wait to receive the mRNA vaccine. And that would be an individual choice. They know that their risk tolerance for an adverse event, and also know their personal situation, how much they may be able to protect themselves using public health measures. And those are all issues that would need to be taken into account when one decides whether to be vaccinated earlier with another vaccine.
Well, the province of Alberta has seen the third wave of the pandemic running wild. The province now has the highest rate in North America of infections per 100,000 people. It is double the rate of the province of Ontario. Pressure mounting for tougher restrictions in the province to try and bring the spread under control and protect a strained healthcare system from collapse. Dr. Noel Gibney is the co-chair of the Edmonton Zone Medical Staff Association's Strategic COVID-19 Pandemic Committee, and he's with me now. Dr. Gibney, first of all, thanks for taking time to speak with me today. I do appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for having me.
How much trouble is Alberta in right now with what seems like this unchecked spread of COVID?
Alberta's in a lot of trouble. I mean, the numbers in large measure speak for themselves with, as you mentioned earlier, twice the rate of Ontario and now the COVID capital of Canada and United States.
To give it some perspective, as I touched on, Alberta's 7-day average of cases per 100,000 people is now roughly double the Ontario numbers. Alberta is now, as you said, tops in North America. How did it get so bad?
I think that's a really good and important question. I think there are two components. The first is that after the second wave, the Alberta government started to open up too early, particularly with the arrival of the new B117 variant, which spreads more rapidly. This kind of spread slowly in the background, and then at a certain point in time reached a critical mass, which was in early April. It was clear to us probably towards the end of February onwards that we were going to get ourselves into significant trouble. And despite that, because I'm sure the government had similar modeling, they continued to open up at a rate that was premature given the arrival of the new variant and the numbers that we were seeing. So I think we opened up too early. The second problem is that even though we've recognized for quite a while now that we're in trouble, the government has simply not introduced public health restrictions that are strict enough to get control of this new variant. Our numbers are such that we recognize that if we continue on the current pathway with just the current levels of restrictions, by the last week of May, the healthcare system will be overwhelmed, and Alberta Health Services will have to introduce the newly announced critical care pandemic triage protocol, which would be really an extraordinary event and one that we really do need to avoid.
So that could be a few weeks away, and I was going to get to that. And to be clear, so people understand what we're talking about, this triage protocol that you and your colleagues have worked on. They're life and death decisions, right? It comes down to who you think is going to be in the best position to survive based on the emergency treatments available, and you have to make choices about who lives, perhaps, and who doesn't.
That's correct. And emergency triage procedures, they're typically kept in a locked drawer until a disaster occurs. This is unusual because, generally speaking, they're used in a situation, say, for example, a major earthquake was to hit Vancouver. At that point in time, it would be very clear nobody was expecting it. It happened, and people would have to implement that kind of protocol. What's so different about this is that we know that this is going to happen. We know how this can be averted. And yet, despite that, our government is continuing ahead on exactly the same trajectory towards what will be a disaster. And that is an extraordinarily, irresponsible approach to take.
We have seen the Premier announce some new restrictions on hotspot cities in the province last week, shutting down indoor fitness centres and pools, and some high schools are going to be closed for left only to virtual learning. Is any of that going to be enough to stop what's happening?
No, not really. We simply have to introduce a firm lockdown, somewhat similar to what was here in the first wave in Alberta last year. Alberta had a very strict response. It resulted in the first wave being managed very efficiently and without any difficulties. And so I think we simply have to go back there. The real challenge that I think we're dealing with at this stage is that the government, its base, simply are rebelling against any form of restriction. And I think that the government's weak response to this is giving them encouragement.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to come to that. I wanted to get to that. We saw very publicized, a small minority of Albertans ignoring the rules this past weekend, with hundreds of people, maybe a couple of thousand, attending a no more lockdowns rodeo on the weekend. Police were there, but they didn't try to stop it. And the Premier tweeted that it's a slap in the face to everyone who is following the public health orders. But do you wonder why more is not being done on the enforcement side? And do you wonder about the messaging coming from political leaders in Alberta?
I think the messaging is one of the major problems. On one hand, the Premier says this is a slap in the face, but unless he actually does something forceful about it, there's no reason that individuals won't continue to behave this way. We saw earlier this year at the Grace Life Church west of Edmonton continue to operate maskless and with large numbers of people attending for 6 months before enforcement was taken. And there's very clearly a lot of mixed messaging coming from the Premier.
All right. Dr. Gibney, thanks for taking time to speak with me about this today. And all of us are watching in the country what's happening in Alberta, and we hope you turn a corner there soon. Thanks for the time today.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Well, opposition MPs were hoping to continue their push today to call the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff before the Defence Committee to be questioned about the allegations of sexual misconduct against the former Chief of Defence Staff, Jonathan Vance. But the Liberal chair of the committee abruptly cancelled the meeting at the last minute. And on Tuesday, MPs will be debating a Conservative motion calling for the House to call for the Prime Minister to fire Katie Telford for failing to notify him of the allegations of sexual harassment against General Vance when they first surfaced from the former military ombudsman 3 years ago. So, lots to follow up on now with these latest developments. 3 members of Parliament. Anita Vandenbeld is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Defence. Michael Barrett is the ethics critic for the official opposition Conservatives. And Randall Garrison is the defence critic for the NDP. Anita Vandenbeld, let me start with you. The Defence Committee was scheduled to meet today to continue debating whether to call Katie Telford as a witness. Why was the meeting cancelled at the last minute?
Well, first of all, the Defense Committee was scheduled actually to talk about our mental health study. And it was, in fact, the opposition on Friday that pushed to suspend the proceedings. And this morning, when it became apparent that Mr. O'Toole said that he was going to put a motion in the House to have the very person that we were debating calling before committee have a motion to have that person fired, at that point, nothing productive could come from a meeting because they'd already presupposed the outcome of the testimony. And I'd like to be clear that the Defense Committee is meeting again on Friday. I think the chair made that very apparent today.
Will this be on the agenda? Will Katie Telford's appearance be on the? I guess it depends what happens to the motion tomorrow. Huh?
Yeah, and I think there's a little bit of crying wolf here because a few weeks ago, the opposition were screaming that we shut down the study when in fact all we did was put a timeline on the report. And we've had 5 more meetings on this since we supposedly shut down the study.
All right, Mr. Barrett,
So
what's your reaction to that, Mr. Barrett?
Well, it's clear this is part of a cover-up. We have a committee that's scheduled to meet, and because the Liberal members don't like what the opposition is going to talk about, they canceled the meeting. It's very clear the reason that opposition parties want to hear from Ms. Telford. The Prime Minister has said he didn't know about the allegations against General Vance, and we've heard that Ms. Telford did know. We heard from the Ombudsman that he informed the Minister, Minister Sajjan, directly that these were allegations of sexual misconduct. So if Ms. Telford knew, and if the Prime Minister is to be believed that he did not know, then what we have a situation here where the Minister of Defense and the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff orchestrated a cover-up and kept the Prime Minister of Canada in the dark.
To Anita Vandenbeld's point, if you want her fired, what's the point of bringing her before committee?
Well, we talk about presupposing outcomes here. Ms. Vandenbeld is presupposing the outcome of a vote in the House of Commons. Let's hear her testimony. Perhaps it would enlighten members of Parliament when this Opposition Day motion comes for a vote.
Right, but you weren't. I don't think there was ever a scenario where you were going to get Katie Telford at the committee before tomorrow's motion calling for her to be fired.
Well, the motion's not going to come for a vote when we immediately, and also we don't get to pick when these days are scheduled. It's not for the chair of the committee to cancel a meeting because she doesn't like what the opposition is going to talk about.
Mr. Okay, we'll come back to Mr. Barrett. Mr. Garrison, let me hear from you on this about the cancellation of that meeting today. What do you think happened here?
Well, if Ms. Telford wanted to appear, we'd have all been there with bells on this morning to hear her testimony. But instead, the chair canceled the meeting, and I think it's important to step back. But she
wasn't scheduled to appear today, right? The debate was going to continue on whether you could call her as a witness.
Well, all you had to do was do a quick call around and say, Katie Telford wants to appear, and all of us would have agreed to that. So let's not play silly games about what's happening in committee. What the Liberals are doing is stalling because they don't want to hear what Ms. Telford has to say. But what's most important here is that if we don't get to the bottom of why there was no action taken against General Vance, then there's no confidence that any reforms going forward will actually be taken seriously by either the survivors of sexual misconduct or the perpetrators. And so we have to know why General Vance was left in office 3 years after a very serious allegation of sexual misconduct. The Minister of Defense says I referred to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister says I didn't know. So somebody here is not telling the truth, I think is the most simple thing you can say.
Ms. Vandenbeld, if there's nothing to see here, if there's nothing to hide, why not have Katie Telford appear at your committee to tell everyone what happened, what she knows? Why not have her go there and then she can set the record straight or give her evidence and then we can all move from there?
Well, I would take exception to what my parliamentary colleagues have been saying about what was known. It's been very clear from all of the testimony, there's no need for further testimony, especially Mr. Marquez, the clerk of the Privy Council, the minister several times have all made it very clear that the nature and specifics of the allegations were not known.
Right, except that to be clear, Mr. Marquez, the first time we heard that the Prime Minister's office might have known ahead of the Privy Council office was in Mr. Marquez's testimony, saying that Katie Telford was aware of it prior to Mr. Sajjan telling the Privy Council to.
I think we have to be very careful what the "it" is, because there was, as Mr. Marquez said, very limited knowledge of what it was. They didn't know the nature. They didn't know what the allegation was. There were no specifics known. But in fact, in 2015, it was Aaron O'Toole who did have rumors about very specific allegations, at least two, maybe three allegations.
Do you acknowledge the testimony? The testimony now puts Katie Telford in the loop.
I would say it's exact opposite, because we actually know now from every single person that testified that the nature of the allegations was not known.
No, but even if she didn't know the name, she was made aware of an allegation, and the Prime Minister says it was never brought to him. So she was aware there was something involving General Vance, and it was never brought up to the Prime Minister.
And I would also take exception, I should say, there was no action because they didn't know what the allegation was. Mr. Walburn never provided what the allegation was. So there was nothing to tell. There was nothing to know. When you don't know what it is, you don't know who it is, you don't know the nature of it.
Mr. Barrett, let me ask you this. The House will debate a Conservative motion. We've talked about it, calling for the firing of Katie Telford. It's not binding on the Prime Minister, and I guess I'm wondering, what would firing Katie Telford accomplish for the victims of sexual misconduct in the military?
Well, first of all, let's be very clear. Ms. Vandenbeld is being disingenuous in her comments. The Ombudsman said very clearly, and he has reaffirmed this several times in media following his appearance at committee, that he informed Minister Sagen directly that the allegations were about sexual misconduct perpetrated by the Chief of the Defence Staff. So that was crystal clear, and he gave that information to the Minister of National Defence. So that's important that we don't selectively listen to the testimony we heard from the former Ombudsman, Mr. Walburn.
So firing Katie Telford does what for the victims of sexual misconduct?
Well, what we have is a situation where the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, if the Prime Minister is to be believed that he didn't know, and we know that Ms. Telford did know, then she covered up allegations of sexual misconduct perpetrated by the Chief of Defence Staff against people under his command. And so there needs to be consequences. People need to see that there's been some action taken. We have a Prime Minister who's done nothing. He sat on the last review that was done for 6 years, and now in response to this, they're pointing and saying, "Oh my gosh, look, the Conservatives heard a rumor in 2015 and had an investigation."
Let me move to Mr. Garrison. Mr. Garrison, do you support the motion to fire Katie Telford?
Well, the Prime Minister himself pointed the finger at Katie Telford in his press conference. I just think it's unfortunate that the Conservatives took the bait. So no, we won't be supporting the motion to fire Ms. Telford, because the one responsible here, and there's only two choices, is the Minister of Defence or the Prime Minister. The Minister of Defence says, "I told the Prime Minister's office," and he clearly knew it was sexual misconduct. So that's where we have the breakdown here in our knowledge. If he told him it was sexual misconduct, and then the Prime Minister wasn't informed, the only one who can tell us that is Katie Telford. And that's why we'd still like to see her appear at committee.
Okay, just about 30 seconds left here. Katie Telford did appear before the committee investigating the We Charity situation, Anita Vandenbeld. Why can't she appear at this committee and answer the questions?
Well, I'd just like to be clear that
I'm just asking that question. Why can't she show up and give? Why can't she tell the committee her side of the story?
That is up to the committee. I think that the fact is that everything we've heard in committee has been consistent. Minister Sagen did say that he disagreed with parts of Mr. Walburn's testimony, and every other witness that we've had has held up the fact and has said again that there were no specifics known, and there's nothing new to learn. There's nothing new because nobody knew any specifics at that time.
We're gonna stop. We're gonna leave. We're gonna leave it at that. We're out of time for tonight, but thank you all for giving us your information. We're continuing to follow where this goes, and we'll follow the motion in the House as well tomorrow. Thank you all for your time tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Well, let's bring in our Monday panel of parliamentary journalists now. Susan Delacourt is a columnist for the Toronto Star. Joël-Denis Bellavance is the parliamentary bureau chief for La Presse. John Ivison is a columnist for the National Post and parliamentary bureau chief for Post Media. Good to see you all again. Susan, let's talk about the tactics we're seeing from the Liberals to prevent Katie Telford from appearing at the Defence Committee. What questions does that raise for you?
It raises any lessons about whether they learned any lessons from the SNC-Lavalin scandal. Which was, I know, a long time ago, like everything before the pandemic feels like. But I think it showed a real tendency of this government to just turtle and turn on its own, turn to protect its own and to be incredibly risk averse when these kind of things happen. So, you've seen Ms. Telford did come out and testify during the We Charity saga last summer.
Right.
It didn't look like she enjoyed that all that much. But the question isn't whether she enjoys this or not. I think this is the Liberals. This is acting the type. They do protect their own. And I'll just say, to be right down the middle on this too, Conservatives, when they were in office as well, had a real aversion to bringing staff members before committees.
Right.
The buck is supposed to stop with the elected person, and it can verge into the realm of bullying. So I think that's been the pushback from the Liberal side. But I would say from 10 paces back, it looks like they're being defensive.
I guess Joël-Denis, on Tuesday, the House will debate a Conservative motion calling for Katie Telford to be fired by the Prime Minister. We have the Defence Committee shut down today, trying to get answers on, trying to get her to come and testify. I guess the bottom line for people watching, and some of this might be inside the Beltway for them, is do they think the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff has something to say to enlighten Canadians about what happened here in this process? What do you think?
Well, most of it is known to us as reporters who've been following this, and there were some chats about whether the defense minister did the right thing by not looking at the allegations that was brought forward by the former ombudsman. And what is the role of the chief of staff of the prime minister in this affair? To me, this is a mystery. But as Susan's mentioned, the Liberals now have adopted a defense strategy, and it is that only ministers will testify in front of committees or the Prime Minister if he's called upon, and no staffers. So that's the line of defense.
Okay.
And I don't think they want to repeat the We Charity affair where a lot of staffers were brought in front of the committee, and it led to, if I may say, a loss of support in the polls because they were seen as being trying to hide facts.
All right, John, what do you think is going on here?
Well, I agree with JD. It's a mystery why Katie Telford's at the centre of this. There's no evidence that she knew anything in particular, whereas there is clear evidence that Harjit Sajjan is in the middle of it. I mean, to me, it's his mess, and ministerial accountability demands that he's the one who should answer for it. I mean, it's clearly part of the National Defence Act that he could have called his own investigation probe into this, to the allegations that were brought to him. And I was talking to somebody who's close to the military today, and they're saying this is a complete distraction. It's turmoil. Every senior person in uniform has got their heads down. They're really just hoping it all passes. In the meantime, the Jonathan Vance's successor has also been removed pending an investigation.
Yep.
The current temporary chief of the defence staff and the defence deputy minister are all engaged in some kind of internal body they're trying to set up to handle harassment charges. It's a mess.
Yeah.
And yet, day by day, the world is getting more dangerous. It's a national security issue. I mean, he put it as bluntly as that. He said, this is worse than the Somali affair, when we entered a decade of darkness.
Okay, well, watch where this takes us. Susan, let's switch gears here. The National Advisory Committee on Immunization issued its guidance on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine today, essentially saying because of safety concerns, basically don't get it unless you'll have to wait too long to get a better vaccine. And yet public health leaders are still saying get the first vaccine available to you. Does all this make sense to you?
That was a moment, almost as surprising as the swear word in question period today. But yeah, I was listening and said, did I just hear that? Because you've heard it from everybody. This whole idea that the government has been trying to tamp down on vaccine shopping. They don't want people out there picking and choosing. And then they said, well, if you have to pick and choose, don't choose that one. I don't know whether Johnson & Johnson can sue them for sort of bad advertising.
Well, I mean, there's 300,000 doses that Canada is still holding on to for quality control concerns, but I think it's 38 million that Johnson & Johnson's agreed to send to Canada. You start to wonder why now.
Yeah, Michelle Rempel was asking about this in the Commons, and I thought she was asking quite sensible questions. Is basically what? And I did think, speaking of defensiveness, that the health minister reacted with, well, you know, you are contributing to people being nervous about vaccines and vaccine hesitancy, which shows you how ridiculous the debate is in the Commons these days. But I think this is a reasonable development that happened today, and I'll be curious to see if they stick to it, because it has the feel of an unintended message to get out there to Canadians.
Joël-Denis, you know, it sounds a bit like deja vu to me. We had the same sort of thing over AstraZeneca, which was the basic message was the same. We have concerns about that. You might want to wait for something else. What do you think Canadians are thinking about all this?
Well, there was fear that people might lose confidence in the vaccines that we're buying when the AstraZeneca issue arose, the thrombose and blood clot. And now this is clearly not a very, very big vote of confidence on the part of the health officials towards Johnson & Johnson. So why bother buying it then? Because we'll have enough anyway from Pfizer and Moderna. So you don't want to lose. You want to make sure that the population does not lose confidence in the vaccination, because that's the way out of this crisis. So there needs to be a clear signal sent by the Prime Minister himself that, you know, this vaccine should be maybe discarded all the way, because this is going to contribute to the lack of confidence towards that vaccine.
John, let me hear your thoughts on this.
Well, there's a clear disconnect between this Vaccine Advisory Committee and Health Canada. They're not sending out the same message on this as they weren't on the AstraZeneca one. And the public is listening. I mean, it gets confused. It doesn't understand, does the Advisory Committee report to Health Canada? How can they be saying different things? But the message gets through, because I went to get the AstraZeneca vaccine, and I just turned up and they said, does anybody want AstraZeneca? And nobody wanted to go near this thing. And I walked straight to the front of the queue, and I was through in 30 minutes because...
And full disclosure, I've had the AstraZeneca. I've already been vaccinated with the AstraZeneca. But a lot of people wonder, what should I do next? What about shot number 2? Do I still get it, or can I mix and match? That's maybe a debate for another day. But Susan, we only have a little bit of time left, so quick answers from everybody here. Let's talk a little bit about what's happened to Lisa Raitt, pushed out of the riding association in Milton, where she used to be the MP, in this battle between the new candidate, Nadeem Akbar, who wanted to bring in an Alberta-based organizer who had worked for Aaron O'Toole and pay him $6,000 to manage the local riding campaign even before it started. So he stacked the riding association election with his own people, and Lisa Raitt and every other director up for re-election was booted out. Big problem for Aaron O'Toole, or not so much?
Yeah, more of the same. I'm from Milton, so I've been saying to my colleagues, it's a tough town. They don't treat their people who lose elections well, obviously. I regret that it happened to Lisa Raitt. Lisa Raitt is well viewed around here, and I think around even Milton too. I think it's a sign that things are not all okay in Conservative land.
JD, what's your thought?
Well, it's a big loss not only for Aaron O'Toole, but for the Conservative Party as a whole, because Lisa Raitt is a voice of reasonableness, of moderation, and she's a woman, and she was a strong woman in the cabinet when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister. So that's a big loss from Mr. O'Toole per se, and the Conservative Party, because she was seen as a moderate voice that was well respected across the country.
We give the last 30 seconds to the Laird of Chelsea, Mr. Ivison. Go ahead.
Well, I think that instant members is not a new phenomenon for the Conservative Party. It's not a huge problem for O'Toole if it's limited to a riding or two, but if it's a more broad, more widespread and coordinated, then it is a problem. But I do remember Chuck Cadman. If you remember back to Chuck Cadman, who was also ousted by instant members, and I remember Don Platt, who was the party president at the time, said, he's like a rock star in that riding, but it's a pity when they came up to ask for autographs that he didn't get them to sign memberships. And then, if you remember, Cadman had the last laugh when he, in the late Chuck Cadman, he didn't vote with the Conservatives on bringing down the government in 2005. So these things tend to come back to bite parties, I think.
All right, we'll watch for what happens next. Thank you all for your time. Appreciate it. We'll talk again.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And that's all the time we have for this edition of Primetime Politics. I'm Peter Van Dusen. Thanks for watching from all of us here at CPAC. Take care.